thank you very much for coming out, and thanks to Paul and George, hello, for asking me to come and speak. It's always a lot of fun to talk about the significance of Tennessee and the Southeast more generally in North America. I'm going to be balancing tools here, so actually I might just, can you hear me without the microphone? Okay. I might just put it down then. Okay. I was asked to discuss this topic of why the Cumberland matters in the early stages of European development. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the Cumberland River within the context of Trans-Appalachia broadly. I liked that Paul Sloan mentioned a minute ago that one of the authors on the Cumberland River also spoke about the Tennessee River because the two rivers are very much connected. Our story is going to begin roughly around the settlement of Charlestown and what today is South Carolina, and then I'll take it up to basically the outbreak of the Anglo-Cherokee War, just prior to the outbreak of the prior to the end of the 7 Years' War or French and Indian War, at which point my esteemed colleague, the great David Britton, will pick up the tale and go forward from there. No pressure. Okay. Well, I want to begin actually with a vignette from 1700. In 1700, the governor of South Carolina, a fellow named Joseph Blake, sent a group of Carolinians down the Tennessee River to the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, or to put it another way, to the confluence of the Tennessee and the Ohio, with the Mississippi not far on the other side. And the purpose of this group of Carolinians activity or endeavor was to divert trade, specifically to divert trade from New France, the French interests along the St. Lawrence River Valley in what today is Canada, into the Great Lakes. By this point, the French were extending into the Mississippi River Valley and were also in the Illinois country. Blake wanted to divert French trade away from this evolving Louisiana that had just been settled a year before in 1700, and divert it towards Charlestown. Leading the expedition, this Carolinian expedition to the confluence of the Ohio, Tennessee, and then more or less the Mississippi as well, was actually a Frenchman, an ex-coureur de bois by the name of Jean Couture. Couture was quite a character in and of himself. And he actually had another venture on his mind as he was going forward with this expedition called for by the governor of Southern Carolina. He had actually been stationed at the Arkansas post in Quapaw territory, just to the west of the Mississippi River as a French post, before deserting and coming east towards Carolina. And along his path back to Carolina, he started to hear about tremendous riches that could be had in the southeast, potentially. Rumors, really. But according to another Frenchman, a man by the name of Sauvole, Couture actually claimed that he had even discovered silver, and a fair amount of silver, and I quote Sauvole here, on the river of the Chouanon. Well, Couture certainly wasn't the first European to make such a claim. Vague descriptions of silver in the Appalachian Mountains and in Trans-Appalachia had circulated amongst Europeans going all the way back to Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1539. But Couture was so convinced of the possibilities here that he actually had gone to Carolina with the idea, or with the proposal to the government of Southern Carolina, that they fund a digging scheme. Why doesn't Carolina fund me as I go back out to this Chouanon River and start to mine for silver? Well, South Carolina ultimately didn't bite on this particular expedition, but it's also very clear at this particular point in 1700 that the Chouanon River was very much on the mind of the Europeans, very much on the radar of the Europeans. Well, the Chouanon River is better known to us today as the Cumberland. And while mining wasn't in the cards for Couture and the Carolinians in 1700, Couture's moment represents something much larger and much more significant than just the possibility of silver. It's actually a critical part of a development in North America that is going to define the 18th century in North America in many ways. Think of the elements represented here in this vignette. We have the Mississippi River, we have the Ohio River, we have the Tennessee River, we have the Cumberland River, we have French interests, we have English interests, we have imperial interests, diversion of trade to benefit the English at the expense of the French. And most importantly of all here, and certainly the players at the moment would have understood this, Couture and his band of merry men would certainly have understood this as much as anybody. Most importantly, Indian interests. Indian interests are absolutely essential here as this story unfolds. I'm going to go on record right now with an assertion to which Europeans in Couture's day would have responded, of course, or as my 10-year-old daughter says, duh. We simply can't make sense of Trans-Appalachia. We can't make sense of the Cumberland, the Tennessee, or Trans-Appalachia generally without placing Indians in the central position. So, the story today is going to revolve around the intersection of European interests with Indian interests. This is of critical importance, and it helps us to better understand why the Cumberland River matters and what it means to 18th century development in North America. I'd like at this point actually to take a look. I know some folks in the back will have a hard time seeing some of this, at a few maps very quickly. The first of which was drawn by a Frenchman in 1682, Jean-Baptiste Louis Franklin. In 1682, he provided this particular image of Trans-Appalachia. Now, obviously, this image, let me get out of the way here. This image is, well, at best, strained in terms of its credulity. Obviously, there's no geographical accuracy. There is nothing but vague ideas here. What you do see is the Mississippi River right here, and then coming off of the Mississippi over here is a river that goes up into the land of the Illinois, and on the edge here it says the Lake of the Illinois. Well, this is a not so good representation of the Ohio River. What we also see here in this particular map is Florida, obviously prominently mentioned, Spanish Florida, La Florida. We also see a lot of references to various Indian towns, particularly here in the middle of the space, this vast space that's mostly empty. It says the Chouanon, 15 villages. Chouanon is the French word for Shawnee. Shawnees actually live in 5 different regions in North America and don't actually begin to coalesce in the Ohio Valley specifically until the 1740s, with the exception of this one group that is in fact sitting on the Cumberland, thus, at least for a period of time, thus the name Chouanon River, as it was known to Europeans at the turn of the 18th century. Well, this is in 1682. 2 years later, Franklin provides this map for his overlords back in Paris, at Versailles specifically. Well, this map is a lot more specific than the previous. It's still exaggerated. It's still not terribly accurate, but it's more explicit. It's more advanced, more nuanced. We see a number of different things here which were not on the previous map. We've got Lake Erie, of course. Lake Frontenac is the French term for Lake Ontario. Over here on the edge, we have Pennsylvania, we have Virginia. Up in here is a very sophisticated understanding of various towns in Iroquois, the 5 nations. And if you look down here in the southeast, you see a number of different references. Here, the St. Louis River, that's the Mississippi. Coming off of the Mississippi, we have these various branches going in a number of directions. Here it says the Ohio, which goes up towards Pennsylvania. Not terribly accurate representation, but not one that's terribly off either when you think about the forks of the Ohio coming off of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers in what today is western Pennsylvania. And then you have other rivers, again, going in various directions. Some of these, what he means here in terms of the statements are lost to history. Some of these represent very specific people and places. Okay, so within 2 years, the French are starting already to develop a relatively sophisticated understanding of the Southeast. I mean, it's, again, not accurate, but it's better in just 2 years. Now, fast forward a few decades, and a third French map, drawn by Guillaume DELISLE in 1718, gives you an entirely different look again, right? Between 1684 and 1718, things become more and more sophisticated for Europeans. They start to understand a number of different realities, riparian and otherwise. You see on this map, obviously, a much more reasonable description or look at the Mississippi River. You see in 1718, there's a settlement. It's hard to see, obviously, or I apologize for that, but the very, very recently settled New Orleans down here. And notice here, you've got these various rivers coming off. The Ohio River going this way, the Tennessee River, this is a representation of the Hiwassee River. More and more representations of what is actually, or what Europeans see here in the Southeast. You'll also see on this map over here, here's Carolina, here's Virginia, here's Maryland, on up. Right here, what today we would call New York, this actually says Iroquois, a recognition of the fact that what today we think of as Western New York is Western New York in name only. It's a European fiction. That's Iroquois. Well, you see an increasingly sophisticated understanding. This matters greatly. So from the European point of view then, there must be something that's pushing them in the direction of greater sophistication in terms of understanding this space, right? To go in a very short amount of time from that to that indicates that the French take this space very, very seriously. The English, nay British, after the 1707 Treaty of Union, or Act of Union, which the Scots these days are trying to break down, the British also take this space very seriously. And the reason that both take this space very seriously, well, can best be explained by looking at another map. Another map that shows exactly this same territory, but you're not going to recognize it at first glance. It's the exact same territory, but from a completely different point of view. What are we looking at here? This is what's known as the Fanny Mingo map. Fanny Mingo is a Chickasaw term. It's defined as Squirrel King. Fanny Mingo was the leader of a group of Chickasaws known as Lower Chickasaws who had broken away from the central Chickasaw area and had come to the Savannah River. Well, as the Lower Chickasaws come and settle along the Savannah River outside of Augusta, they bring with them on a parchment of deerskin this map. The map is actually from 1723. Unfortunately, the British lost the 1723 map, but the British did make a perfect, exact representation of it, albeit with a few English designations on it. So what we're looking at here is an Indian understanding of the Southeast. What are we looking at? Well, you see a number of circles here. Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, English, Cherokees. You see a number of other circles. Up here, that circle is a representation of Senecas, the Five Nations, the Iroquois. That is the upper end of the Ohio River, which is represented by this line. Oops, I'm sorry. This line right here. Coming off of that central line are a number of other points that I would draw your attention to. Trade paths coming off like this, but coming right here, the Tennessee River. Coming out, you notice, touching on Cherokee country. Here's the Wabash River heading up towards the Great Lakes. Down here, this is the Illinois country. Notice that it's detailed with a hunter and a deer. This is fertile territory, right? Illinois, important territory. And then coming here is the Mississippi River. Okay, so, and then these other representations, these other lines are trade paths. Okay, so this map gives us a better understanding of the Southeast from the Indian point of view. This is an Indian world. The Southeast is fundamentally an Indian world. You notice the English rate a circle, true enough, all the way over on the margin. That's Carolina, South Carolina, in 1725. The English rate a circle on the margin. The reality is that this space is controlled by Indian groups. This is an Indian world, and the Europeans are trying gradually to break into that world. And what it creates in the mind of a lot of Europeans is imagined ideas of empire, imagined ideas of sovereignty, imagined ideas of imperial confrontation between the British and the French that both directly affect Indian groups and are affected by Indian groups. It's critical to understand then, to the point that I started with here, you cannot understand the Southeast, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, without understanding the role of Indian groups and their primacy in this space. It's an Indian world, and the Europeans are on the margins, pushing into it. That brings with it a number of things. And that's what I want to do right now. As Europeans start to push into this space, what I want to do is talk about what that means. Because Europeans particularly are pushing into this space, first with the French in the 1660s, vaguely, very vaguely, but then with the settlement of Charlestown in 1670. And what this space is going to represent is powerfully meaningful to both Europeans and to Indians. What I'm going to do is start sort of broad with theoretical anthropology ideas, but then I'm going to bring it down to the specific. And I'm going to say, what exactly does this mean to Indians and Europeans who are making use of the Tennessee River, who are making use of the Cumberland River. So we're going to start broad and go specific, keeping this map in the background. And when we come back at the end of the discussion to this particular map, well, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense, even if it also, quite frankly, would be a little bit confusing too, because the more you get into this story, the more you realize it's complicated, and it doesn't always make a lot of sense. A very good friend of mine, an esteemed colleague, once said, if colonial America makes sense to you, you're not paying attention. Well, I can reinforce that. If this makes a whole lot of sense to you, you're not paying attention. Okay, well, let's go forward here. And what I want to begin with is an idea that directly connects with this intersection of European interests and evolving European interests, imperial interests, and Indian realities. The intersection of Indian culture and European imperial interests. They start to intersect, well, with Hernando de Soto. But for the purposes of this story today, this really begins with the settlement at Charlestown. And what I'm going to be talking about here for the next minute or two is something known as the Mississippian Shatter Zone. Question, what is the Mississippian Shatter Zone? Well, yes, it doesn't immediately jump off the tongue as something that makes sense. So let me explain. Mississippian is actually the culture that defines Indian groups in the Southeast, going all the way back to around the year 900. Prior to that, there typically are more woodland cultures, but starting around 900, you see the development of Mississippian Indian culture. This Mississippian culture progresses forward into the 18th century before finally completely collapsing around 1730, right around the turn of the 18th century. So the Shatter Zone is this space in which Mississippians lived and in which Mississippian communities ultimately collapsed and were replaced by another form of Indian community. Let me explain just briefly what Mississippian culture looked like. Mississippians were broken into elite and non-elite lineages. They were organized into a political organization that we can call, for the lack of a better word, a chiefdom. Mississippian chiefdoms could be large and they could be small. A paramount chiefdom incorporated smaller chiefdoms within it in a sort of hierarchical political structure. The center of a Mississippian chiefdom were earthen temple mounds. You might be familiar with these. Temple mounds. Cahokia is, of course, arguably the most famous, but there are Mississippian mounds all over Tennessee as well, and in Georgia and in other places. These mounds were the place where the chiefly elite lived. Chiefly elite lived on the mounds of varying size. Commoners tended to live in areas around the mounds. Commoners also tended to live in settlements that were scattered along river valleys where the chiefdoms tended to be. So rivers are very important in the chiefdoms because of the fact that you've got a river at the heart of a lot of the chiefdoms, small and then paramount. These chiefdoms are generally very self-sufficient. Again, they can be small or large. And prior to European arrival, prior to the Columbian contact, Mississippian chiefdoms rose and fell on their own rhythm. They rose and fell based on warfare. They rose and fell based on ecological problems. They rose and fell based on the depletion of resources. All of these things should sound familiar to us. They rose and fell in their own rhythm. It's a process that archaeologists and anthropologists call cycling. The chiefdoms rose and fell in a cycling pattern. This cycling pattern creates an overall stability in the Mississippian world. Some chiefdoms rise, others fall. Overall, there is a stability in the Mississippian world. In effect, then, the day before the arrival of Europeans, Mississippians lived, and I quote a critically important anthropologist who's working today on these ideas, Robbie Etheridge. Robbie Etheridge says this: the day before the Europeans arrived, Mississippians, and I quote her, lived in a heterogeneous world composed of dozens of polities, albeit with many cultural, social, and economic traits in common. Okay. That's the day before the Europeans arrived. The day after the Europeans arrived, the world starts to break down. The Mississippian world starts to break down. It starts to change. It doesn't happen overnight, but between Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1539 and about 1730, again to quote Etheridge, chiefdoms began to collapse in succession, interrupting the processes that had regulated regional stability. The process of cycling was disrupted because of the arrival of Europeans over this century-plus stretch. Thus, then, we get this idea of shatter zone. The Mississippian chiefdoms that are shattering. They're breaking down in the southeast. It can be defined as, again, according to Etheridge, a region of instability in the American southeast that existed from the 16th century to the early 18th century. The process of cycling is breaking down. An increasing level of chaos is developing as Mississippian chiefdoms are not able to deal with the pattern of instability. The Mississippian shatter zone is created by the combined conditions of structural instability in the Mississippian world and the inability of chiefdoms to withstand the forces of European colonialism as they're evolving. And then the last point, and the most critical point as we go forward in thinking about the Cumberland and the Tennessee, is that there are three things that particularly define the experience of the shatter zone. What is it that's breaking down these chiefdoms? Well, we can point specifically at disease epidemics, the deerskin trade, and the Indian slave trade. Well, disease epidemics speak for themselves, and of course, epidemics are complicated, right? Some groups are not hit with disease epidemics for extended periods of time. Others are. You cannot assign disease as the sole reason for population declines, although it's certainly part of it. I'm going to leave that one alone and instead focus for just a minute or two on the deerskin trade and the Indian slave trade, because they are so important in terms of historical development in the Southeast, why the Cumberland matters, why the Tennessee matters, and why this world becomes so important to evolving realities of the 18th century. Let's talk about, well, let me put it this way. The deerskin trade and the Indian slave trade, we can pretty sharply identify as beginning in 1670. 1670 is when this really gets going here. It's connected directly with Carolina. Carolina, the Tennessee predecessor, right? Directly connected with Carolina. Almost upon the moment of the settlement of Charlestown in 1670, Carolinians started to look westward. English Carolinians started looking westward. One particular Englishman named William Talbot, who was someone working on behalf of the proprietors who ran the Carolina government, wrote back to the proprietors only 2 years after Charlestown's settlement and said this. Let me quote him here. "Far from serving as a barrier to expansion," I quote, "the Appalachian Mountains stoop to your lordship's dominions and lay open a prospect into unlimited empires," right? The English can expand outward. We can go west, across the Appalachians, into the west, towards the Mississippi River, and create imagined, fictionalized ideas of empire, well, that the French are going to have something to say about in terms of the imagined world, and of course that Indian groups are going to have something to say about as well. The process of expanding English empire out of Carolina is directly connected with deerskin and Indian slaves. Let's start in this conversation, start with the Indian slave trade, because it's perhaps the less well known of the two elements that are affecting Indian and Southeastern life at this particular moment. Okay. The English wanted a labor force. Obviously, this is very well known to people who are looking into early North American history, early modern North American history. The English needed labor force. Already, Virginians had been toying around with the idea of enslaving Indians for various reasons. They had created an Indian slave trade in the 1640s that connected Indian slave sales with the West Indies. So there's already something that's building, albeit something that's different from what Carolina becomes. Carolina is looking for a labor force. And Carolina also realizes, as they're looking for a labor force, that in terms of thinking west, they don't have the manpower. They don't have the reach necessary to go all the way out into the west, as they would have described it, and acquire the labor that they were looking for. Thus, they started to talk to Indian groups, particularly about developing trade relations, right? The English are going to offer goods of superior quality and quantity, and in return for those goods of quality goods and the large quantity of goods, well, the English would like something back, something potentially profitable, both deerskins and Indian slaves. Indian slaves first, but before we get into deerskin, well, so you need to acquire a raiding partner. Thus we see the English begin to develop relationships with various Indian groups. First with the Westos. Westos were originally known as Eries. They came south off of the Lake Erie in the 1650s and settled in Virginia, where they became known to the English as Rickahockans, and then they came south again to the Savannah River and became known as Westos. Westos became brutal slave raiders. There's just no other way of putting it. And they were more than willing to trade in human capital with the English in return for English commodities. They were the dominant Indian slaver for the decade of the 70s, before the English actually wiped out the Westos. Westos no longer exist today. And as in the early 1680s, as Westos are wiped out, the English establish slave raiding relationships with other groups, Yamasees, for example, and Chickasaws. Chickasaws, of course, are going to take you very deep into the southeast, all the way to the Mississippi and beyond the Mississippi, as Chickasaws begin to raid for slaves in areas that today we would call Choctaw territory, and areas that today we would call Quapaw territory or Arkansas territory across the Mississippi River. Well, Indian slave raiding has a huge impact. Obviously, in the sense that you're creating raiding partners with Indian groups, that in turn is going to create conflict between the various Indian groups. It's going to cause instability in the Mississippian world. These Indian slaves, some of them are put to work in Carolina. In 1710, 25% of Southern Carolina's slave population was Indian. Obviously, that means that the other 75% of the Carolina slave population was of African origin, but 25% of the Carolina's slave labor force in 1710 was of Indian origin. That was less common. Obviously, 25% is no small number. What more often would happen, however, is that the Carolina slave raiders, once they had acquired their human capital, human commodities from Chickasaws or Yamasees, what they would then do is turn around and sell them into the international or the Atlantic slave market, so that you had Indian slaves going out into the Atlantic world. These Indian slaves were sold to New Englanders. These Indian slaves were sold to the West Indies. An historian named Alan Gallay noted a real irony in this evolution of the Indian slave trade, particularly in the terms of the Atlantic slave trade, in that, okay, when you sell slaves into the Atlantic slave market, you're by definition acquiring capital, right? Revenue. Well, what the Carolinians are doing is acquiring the capital that they then sink back into African slavery. So in effect, Gallay says you have a double slave economy. Indian slaves funding African slaves. It's a very complicated idea, but the end result for purposes of the shatter zone idea is that this creates an incredible instability in the Mississippian world. Let me put it this way. According to Alan Gallay and another historian named Peter Wood, Wood and Gallay have estimated that as much as half of the Southeast's Indian population losses, half of the decline over this period between 1685 and 1715 came from the Indian slave trade. Half of the population decline. The other half came from war and disease. Robbie Etheridge points to the problem from another perspective, from those who are actually living in the chiefdoms. 1,700 Indians a year are taken from these various Mississippian chiefdoms in an era when a simple chiefdom only has a population of 2,000 to 5,000. This is a significant population loss, right? This creates an incredible instability in the Mississippian world. An incredible instability. We can add that to this instability, the problem of the deerskin trade. Now, everybody, I'm sure, is aware of fur trading in North America. It's a critical part of the North American experience broadly. It's big business, the fur trade is in North America. The problem for Carolinians is that they just don't have beaver pelts like one would see in Canada, like one would see coming out of New York, etc. So they can't compete with French furs or with northern colonial furs. But they can compete with deerskin. Let me put it this way. One Carolinian wrote a letter back to some colleagues in London in the 1680s, and he said this: "There are such continuous herds that the whole country seems to be one continued deer park." Carolina has deer, and the further west you go, the more you're going to get into deer. Okay, so what this then means is that deerskins become huge. They're used for bookbinding in Europe. They're used for fashion in Europe. Particularly in 1702, Carolinians, in the high fashion of the day, took a liking to something they call the Carolina hat. The Carolina hat is literally just a hat made out of deerskin. Becomes big business. It's high fashion in London in 1702. What it means as a practical matter, well, you're talking about a lot of deerskin. Between 1699 and 1715, 53,000 skins a year valued at 30,000 pounds sterling. Significant sum of money. No chump change, as some of my friends have put it. Obviously, this pales in comparison by 1715 to the evolving rice trade in Carolina and so forth, but it's not small change. Okay, well, the deerskin trade becomes problematic to Mississippian chiefdoms because of just basic realities. There's a shift in Indian hunting culture. A shift in Indian hunting culture through which the mass acquisition of furs, of deerskin, becomes the norm. This is something different than Indian cultures had been prior to the mass acquisition of deer skins. Deer were not hunted in massive numbers. Indian communities, Mississippian chiefdoms, tended only to hunt what they needed. They didn't create oversupply or anything like that. Well, this changes the equation. This changes the equation because the English have good commodities, very good commodities, and they have good quality commodities and high quantities, and again, the English want something in return. That shifts hunting culture towards mass acquisition. It also creates a reality in this Atlantic economy that I mentioned that becomes more and more and more rigid. It's an economy defined by credit and debt. Certainly we can understand this after the last 6 or 8 years. Credit and debt. People are locked into this increasingly rigid economy. This increasingly rigid economy that, well, neither Europeans nor Indian groups fully understand how to deal with. This is something remarkable. And that increasing rigidity creates a number of problems. More and more Indian groups find themselves in debt because of the nature of the deerskin trade. You see over the course of the 1730s, 40s, 50s, increasing challenges between Indian groups over hunting territory. One of the most interesting in the Tennessee area, of course, is the confrontation between Lower Creeks and Overhill Cherokees over how you define hunting space. What is Creek space? What is Cherokee space? Well, there's serious tension between Creeks and Cherokees because of that. These issues combined create a number of problems: credit, debt, the inability of the Europeans to engage in any meaningful diplomacy that causes confusion. These things lead to violent outbreaks, such as in 1711 when the Tuscaroras in North Carolina attack the settlements around New Bern, and then the biggest one of them all, the Yamasee War, which breaks out in 1715. Its reverberations stretch all the way out to the Mississippi River, and it comes very close, surprisingly close, to destroying the South Carolina colony. So you have these serious consequences here, major consequences. The deerskin trade and the Indian slave trade, combined with disease epidemics, create a shatter zone. They create a shatter zone. What it means is that, again, to go back to that definition, is that Mississippian chiefdoms can no longer cycle. The process is disrupted. Mississippian chiefdoms begin to collapse. As they begin to collapse, particularly accelerating after 1670, and now we're really getting into the specifics here and how the Cumberland and the Tennessee relate to this, as they begin to collapse, well, new societies begin to emerge. What are known as coalescent societies. Coalescent societies start to emerge out of the collapse of these Mississippian chiefdoms. Examples of these coalescent societies are Yamasees, Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Catawbas. These groups all more or less are formed in the mid to late 17th century and 18th centuries. They're relatively new titles, in other words, in the grand scheme of things. Mid-17th century into the 18th century. As these groups are coalescing, they're starting to ask very serious questions about what that means, right? Who are we? What does it mean to be in this coalescent society? A few points quickly. These coalescent societies have no sense of national identity. Cherokees don't think of themselves in 1730 as living in a Cherokee nation by any stretch. To continue with the Cherokee example, Cherokees identified, yes, by clan. I'm sure everyone's heard that before, but more fundamentally, they also identify according to town and region, so that town and region becomes critically important to how Cherokees think about themselves. Rather than a broad Cherokee nation, what you see is a commitment to overhill towns, to lower towns, to middle towns, to valley towns. This is why if you go back and look at the records from the 18th century, you see those references. They matter. They're not throwaway statements that the English are making about, well, the overhills are doing this and the lower towns are thinking that. Yes, they all have the label Cherokee, but the overhills and the lower towns don't necessarily march lock and step. There is no notion of a national identity. That's a European idea. The British and the French both are trying desperately to project a sense of nationalism on these groups that don't understand it. Similarly, sovereignty is a European idea. Sovereignty is a completely European idea in the mind of the Indian. Let me put it this way. In all of the indigenous dialects that exist east of the Mississippi River, not a single Indian dialect has a word for sovereignty. Not a single one has a word for sovereignty. So you have these European ideas that start to come into play here as the shatter zone is coming into play. As I started this conversation, so I'll say again, European ideas and Indian cultures are connecting. They're coming together in this shatter zone. A few last quick points before we move on to some more specific ideas is that these Indian groups, these coalescent societies, they're autonomous. They have they are entirely self-determined. They are not pawns to Europeans. Yes, the shatter zone has had a significant effect on who they are, but if you'll recall Fanny Mingo's map, this is an Indian world. It's an Indian world in which they live, and Indian groups, these coalescent societies, are making reasonably self-determined decisions. They're engaging in diplomacy on their own terms, and Europeans are going to have to come to grips with that. Europeans actually make that effort to come to grips with that, given this evolving idea of European imperial interests. Europeans are more than willing to play this game. And so what in effect we have here then is a fascinating reality as we start to turn even more into specifics. These two cultures are clashing with one another, they're interacting with one another, they are informing one another. Indian groups control the southeastern space, and from the European perspective, the French and the Spanish particularly would say there's a big problem here. You have English-Indian interaction that stretches by the early part of the 18th century from Charlestown all the way to the Mississippi River, right? The English are projecting outward. If we were to go back to that statement I made a minute ago, William Talbot, the Appalachian Mountains stoop to your lordship's dominions, right? Well, from the English point of view, there's this imagined projection here. The French and the Spanish see it as well. It's an European imperial echo chamber. I mean, there's no practical French or British or Spanish or meaningful control here, or any control at all. But in this echo chamber, these things matter more and more and more. And thus we get, again, to the beginning of this conversation. Jean Couture, coming out in 1700. Well, this matters, right? An ex-Frenchman who comes to the English colonies and then goes back out again to try to find silver on the Cumberland River. Holy schlamoli, this is mind-blowing to the French. This is dangerous. And so we need to talk then a little bit more about this European idea as these groups are coming together here. Couture reminds us of how important the Cumberland is going to be in this evolving world. The Tennessee River is also particularly crucial, as the French very well understand, both with Couture in the Cumberland and also with the Tennessee River. Just by way of example, in 1680, now just remember, 1680, that's 10 years past the settlement at Charlestown. In 1680, a French explorer named Robert DELISLE encouraged French exploration of the Southeast because, and I'm quoting him here, because he was convinced, quote, that the river on which the Chickasaws live has as its source a place near Carolina, where the English are, 300 leagues to the east of the Mississippi River, whence the English would be able to come by ship to the Illinois, to the Miami and close to the country of the Sioux, and thereby secure a great portion of our Indian trade. They're very well aware of these riparian realities. Franklin's maps are starting to become more sophisticated. 2 years after that, La Salle argued pretty forcefully in a letter that should the English figure out that an avenue to the Mississippi existed, and I quote, at the foot of the Appalachian Hills, they might by means of that river trade with the Illinois and the Miami and other savages and spoil forever our commerce. Put in context again, what was it that the governor of South Carolina wanted of Couture and his band of merry men? To divert French trade, right? The French are aware of it, the English are aware of it. The Southeast is becoming an important part of these imperial designs in North America. By the middle of the 1690s, a Frenchman named Henri Tonty observed, and I quote Tonty here, some of the English from Carolina have settled on a branch stream running into the Ohio, which falls into the Mississippi. Talking about the Tennessee River there. 1699, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville pointed out that the English presence has led to trade with Chickasaws specifically for, and I quote him here, tobuckskins and Indian slaves. Again, specific reference to this theoretical idea of shatter zone, as the French make specific reference to the Chickasaw, deerskin, and slave raiders. 1700, Couture goes out on behalf of the English. 2 years after that, 2 French voyageurs come down the Wabash River, as they call it, and continued on what they thought was a natural path to Tennessee, to the Tennessee River, and then to the Carolina colony. Along the way, these 2 Frenchmen made note of Chickasaw villages that were near the mouth of the Tennessee River, around 140 leagues from the Mississippi, they said. Just 40 leagues from the Mississippi, they said. And they described several villages, and I quote them again, where there is an Englishman established to trade in slaves, as they are among many other Indian nations. All right. As a practical matter then, as we think about this imagined space and the practical realities of it then, according to the French, the English are sitting at the confluence of the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers on the Ohio with their slave raiders, right across the river from the Illinois country, only 40 leagues from Mississippi. This is the same time, of course, that the French are showing their own interests in the Mississippi River Valley and in the Illinois country. And this, of course, is dangerous. And by the way, you can go today, if you ever go to Paducah, you go right across the river to a state historic park called Fort Massac, and you can see at Fort Massac the mouth of the Tennessee River. Just up from that is the Cumberland. You can see exactly what the French saw on La Belle Riviere, the Ohio River. Well, the response to this is increasing attention. The French and the Spanish. I'm going to focus just on the French and leave the Spanish to Monsieur Britain, because they become very, very important in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s. But particularly for the French here, well, the French start to establish their own efforts at stabilized Indian relationships. They establish a relationship with Choctaws. They establish a relationship, or attempt to, am I out of time? Oh, crumb. Okay, well, a number of consequences here. Mobile, French Lick, Fort Toulouse, Fort Tombecby, Fort Massac, over the first 5 decades of the 15th century. You'll notice here also that there's a Tennessee corridor. French Lick, Fort Massac, Tennessee River, Cumberland River, Ohio River, Wabash River, all come together at this confluence, right at the mouth of the Tennessee and the Cumberland, geopolitically, it's critically important. What goes on in this corridor, the Tennessee River, Cumberland River, Ohio River, Wabash River, all critically important. So, to finish up then, if we look again at the Fanning Mingo map, well, suddenly what we have here then is a serious question of geopolitical reality. This is an Indian world, but when the English get this map at Charlestown, or specifically at Savannah, in 1723, they see opportunity here, right? We can project outwards. We can create relationships with these various circles of power, of influences. We can use the Tennessee River. We can use the Cumberland River. We can send, if possible, Cherokees up the Wabash, into the Wabash River Valley. Cherokees prove willing to do so. Cherokees never establish a one-to-one alliance with the British, but Cherokees increasingly are going out into this corridor. The French are attempting to establish relations with Cherokees in this corridor. The Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers thus matter greatly, even if there's a limited population here. Just last quote that I would provide for you is a statement exactly to this effect. In 1725, a French official named Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, he was Sieur de Bienville, he reported that French garrisons on the upper end of the Wabash River couldn't stop English raids from Carolina. English Carolina raids were coming all the way up to the Wabash River Valley, up towards Fort Vincennes. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because they weren't actually English. They were all Indians, Cherokees, and Chickasaws that were going up there. And as Lemoyne put it, they all came by way, and I quote him here, of the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee rivers. There's a tremendously important geopolitical reality here. Indians and Europeans are interacting on these riparian systems. They're establishing a world of fictive empires. Europeans are, as both Europeans and Indians in North America try to identify who they are. Who are we? Both groups are having to deal with this. And what it then means as you move into the 1760s and 70s and in the Revolutionary period, this space is not new, but part of a much bigger European story, a much bigger Indian story. The confrontations that take place on the Cumberland and on the Tennessee in the 1760s and 70s and 80s, part of a much bigger story that dates all the way back to the 17th century. And has tremendous consequence. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry I took up too much time. By the way, one other map. Wrong way. Sorry. This is a map drawn by a British man, John Stuart, in 1757 as the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, is unfurling. This shows you the corridor really well from the British point of view. On this side over here, those are overhill Cherokee towns. Tennessee River, Cumberland River, here's the Hiwassee again. Here is Fort Massac on the Ohio River that is going to go up like so, and then, like so, and then you've got the Wabash River right here. The Wabash, and then up here are the forks of the Ohio, and it says right there, Fort Duquesne. All of these spaces are connected.